Good evening, and welcome back to the Poe Museum. Tonight we're going to take a look at one of Edgar Allan Poe's early poems he wrote when he was about 19 or 20 years old. But it took him nearly 15 years to finish it. You probably haven't heard of this one, but a few people who have read it say it just might be one of the most important things he ever wrote, and that it also might contain the key to understanding everything Poe wrote. We'll find out what it is and unlock the key to understanding Poe's oeuvre in tonight's installment of the Curator's Crypt. So here's the first printing right here. This is Poe's second book. It's called Alaraf, Tamerlane, and Minor Poems. There's only about 18 copies of it that still survive. So of course this isn't the cover. We keep it locked up inside of this. And inside of that is another cover. All to protect this book in its original covers. I think it's held up pretty well for being a book from 1829 that Poe published when he was just 20 years old. Right back here is Poe's longest poem, Alaraf. And as an introduction to Alaraf, he has this little untitled poem. So it's not even really a standalone poem here. It's more of an introduction. But let's take a read at it and see what it says. I'm going to read you the final version of it to give you an idea what Poe had in mind. It goes a little like this. Science, true daughter of old time thou art, who alterest all things with thy peering eyes, why preyest thou upon the poet's heart, vulture, whose wings are dull realities? How should he love thee, or how deem thee wise, who wouldst not leave him in his wandering to seek for treasure in the jeweled skies? Albeit he soared with an undaunted wing, hast thou not dragged Diana from her car and driven the Hamadryad from the wood to seek a shelter in some happier star? Hast thou not torn the Naiad from her flood, the elfin from the green grass, and from me the summer dream beneath the tamarind tree? So this is Poe writing a sonnet, a 14-line rhymed poem. There's a lot of rules to being a sonnet, but this is Poe's sonnet addressed to science. And here's Poe who's grown up loving science, especially astronomy, at a telescope so he can look at the stars from his porch. And now he wants to be a poet. And he's trying to reconcile this love of science, this thirst for knowledge, with his love of poetry and fantasy. How can he have it both ways? He thinks of science as this vulture that steals the magic from the world. It drives the tree spirits from the trees, and the water nymphs from the water, and the elves from the grass, and leaves you with dull realities, just trees and water and grass. And with science, you can't even look at the stars and imagine that's Diana up in the sky. No, you've ruined that too. It alterest all things. So can he reconcile science with poetry, which even steals the dream from him? He's just trying to take a nap underneath the tree and have a dream, and science ruins that too. So this is an introduction to Poe's longer poem I mentioned, Alaraf. And Alaraf has kind of a similar theme. It's set on Alaraf, which in Poe's mind is a star, and that star is kind of like limbo. It's for spirits are not so bad that they have to go to hell, but not quite good enough to go to heaven, so they're just going to stay on Alaraf for a while. And Alaraf is just floating through the universe. It's being piloted by a spirit named Ligeia, and it's just the most beautiful place ever. It's perfect beauty. There's beautiful architecture from all the vanished civilizations of the world. There's beautiful nature and flowers. And Michelangelo, the sculptor, his spirit's there with a spirit from another planet, and they're just enjoying being surrounded by nothing but beauty. But meanwhile, Ligeia is thinking, I've got to get out of here. I need to go to heaven. I've been on Al-Araf too long. So she prays to God, and God tells her, you can go to heaven, but Al-Araf is just going to poof out of existence, and you're not going to be in that world of perfect beauty because heaven is a world of perfect knowledge and wisdom. So you're going to give up beauty for wisdom, give up this perfect ideal land for perfect ideal knowledge. And Michelangelo says, hey, I like it here better, so I'm going to stay here. I don't care about perfect wisdom and knowledge. I just want to be here where it's beautiful with my spirit girlfriend, and we're going to stay here even if it means we go to sleep forever. So that's the poem. That's the plot of it, and people in Poe's day didn't know what to think of it. One critic from Poe's day said that it looked like he'd just written a bunch of verses on scraps of paper and thrown them up in the air, let the wind toss them wherever they may, and just put it together. That's the poem. Another critic said, well, it's nonsense, but it's exquisite nonsense. So people couldn't quite make sense of Al-Araf, even if I think that this sonnet he wrote kind of gives us a hint to what Al-Araf's all about. Poe is choosing beauty over knowledge and wisdom and science. He wants a world of perfect beauty. But critics did kind of like Sonnet to Science, and Poe reprinted the poem as a standalone poem in the Saturday Evening Post, and it was reprinted from there in other magazines. We have one of those right here. This is The Casket, Literature, Wit, and Sentiment, from October 1830, and on the back, there's a little bitty sonnet there by Edgar A. Poe. So he probably didn't get paid for this. This was just reprinted from another publication. But a year later, he decided to reprint the poem in his next book of poetry. This one is just called Poems. And here's another little covering for it. Retains its original wrappers. There's the original inscription by one of Poe's classmates at West Point who hated the book. So here it is, right here. And it's sort of being used as an introduction once again to Al-Araf. But Poe still thought this was kind of a good poem on its own. So 5 years later, when he got a job working at the Southern Literary Messenger, a magazine here in town, he brought his old poem out and printed it right here. Once again called Sonnet. And each time he's making minor revisions, touching it up here and there. A few years later, he got hired by Graham's magazine to write an article about an illustration. It was a mezzotint engraving of this little island in a stream, and Poe decided to come up with a whole story about this little scene. It was called The Island of the Fae. And he once again used this sonnet as an introduction. He changed the sonnet a little bit again this time, but The Island of the Fae is a very short story. Some people just consider it maybe more of a caption or an article sort of describing what's in the picture, but it's really Poe just using that as a writing prompt and just going out there and coming up with a whole new story. It's about a man who's just sort of wandering through the wilderness and contemplating the nature of reality. And is this all there is? Are we really the end-all be-all? Or is the universe just getting infinitely bigger and smaller at the same time? Are we just part of a larger system and all the smaller systems are within us? Or as the story's narrator describes it, as we find cycle within cycle without end, yet all revolving around one far distant center, which is the Godhead, may we not analogically suppose in the same matter, life within life, the less within the greater, and all within the Spirit divine? So here's the narrator contemplating where we stand in the universe. And then he sees this little island in the middle of the river, and a fairy, just riding a little fairy canoe, comes out and rides around the island. He notices that one end of the island is all bright and sunny. By the time the fairy gets to the other end, it's dark and shadowy. And then the fairy just sort of goes around and then comes all the way back around. It's almost like it's going through a whole year of its life, all the seasons of nature. And when it comes back around, it's just a little bit older, a little bit wiser, and a little bit sadder. And it goes around and around, and every time it comes back around the island to the sunny side, it's a little bit sadder. It gains wisdom, but it loses a little bit of the magic of life. And it's getting more and more melancholy, and eventually it's going to fade away into the darkness. Yeah, so that story is kind of a downer. But once again, he uses his sonnet as an introduction to kind of explain what he's getting at. That as the fairy's gaining knowledge and gaining wisdom, it's losing life. It's losing that appreciation for the beauty around it, for the magic around it. So Poe still liked the poem, and he decided to use it again. Just a couple years after that, he was starting to make a name for himself. He was publishing some short stories like The Murders in the Rue Morgue, The Pit and the Pendulum, The Telltale Heart. So in 1843, the Saturday Museum published an article about Poe, so he gave them his poem. Now he came up with the title Sonnet to Science. That's the title you're going to find underneath when you look at the anthologies today. And he also had the final revised version of it in that article. So if you're doing the math, the first version's from roughly 1829 and the final version 1843. So it took him about 14 years to finish this, to get it right where he wanted it. And sure, he liked the poem. He liked it enough that he included it in his next and last collection of poetry called The Raven and Other Poems. But this one is kind of set off in the back here. It's the first poem in a section called Poems Written in Youth. And he explains way down here at the bottom why he included these poems that he wrote when he was young. So he says, private reasons, some of which have reference to the sin of plagiarism and others to the date of Tennyson's first poems, have induced me, after some hesitation, to republish these, the crude compositions of my earliest boyhood. They are printed verbatim, without alteration from the original edition, the date of which is too remote to be judiciously acknowledged. So that's Poe saying that, the only reason he's printing these little crude early poems is because people have been accusing him of imitating Tennyson. He wants to say, no, I wrote my poems before Tennyson wrote his poems, therefore, I'm not the imitator here. But Poe, besides, making the excuse that it's kind of a crude poem, still reprinted it in the Broadway Journal. So he at least thought of it enough to keep printing it. And I think he appreciated the poem a little bit more than he let on. So what do you think this poem tells us about Poe? Well, first of all, let's imagine that he's reprinting this, gradually, subtly revising it over the course of 14 or 15 years. He might have started it when he was 19, published when he was 20, but he's 34 by the time he comes up with this final authorized version. And over the years, it's not just the poem that's changing. Poe himself is evolving. He's developing. He's not the same person he was when he first wrote this. So I think his perspective has changed too. And I think that science became an integral part of his work. And if it weren't the case, he would have been one of the pioneers of science fiction, using real scientific details and pseudoscience to make his seemingly impossible stories seem real. He would have been the inventor of the detective story, featuring a character who's using reason and analysis, the latest in criminology, to solve seemingly impossible crimes. Science has become hugely important to Poe's work. In fact, his last book is Eureka. I've told you about this before in a previous installment of the Curator's Crypt. This is his long philosophical essay in which he explains all the mysteries of the universe. And it begins with something that seems to directly address that early version of Sonnet to Science, this early poem Al Araf, or even to an extent the Island of the Fae. In the introduction, Poe dedicates the poem to the few who love me and to whom I love, for those who feel rather than to those who think, to the dreamers and those who put faith in dreams as in the only realities. I offer this book of truths, not in its character of truth teller, but for the beauty that abounds in its truth, constituting it true. To these I present the composition as an art product alone, let us say as a romance, or if I be not urging too lofty a claim, as a poem. So here's Poe saying that truth is beauty. This is a sentiment we've heard before from other poets, but Poe's finally acknowledging that really understanding science and the systems that make the universe work is to really discover the true beauty that abounds all around us. So far from hating science, Poe ended up making it an integral part of his works. And of course, his last book, Eureka, which on the very last line of the very last page contains a line that reminds me a lot of that line I mentioned for the Island of the Fae. The final line of Eureka reads, "In the meantime, bear in mind that all is life, life within life, the less within the greater, and all within the Spirit divine." So this is Poe acknowledging, just like the narrator of the Isle of the Fae, that we're just a tiny part of a massive universe. There's a whole system that's so beautiful in its organization that Poe in this book considers the universe itself to be a poem, to have a plot. You got to read the book. You got to check that earlier episode of the Curator's Crypt and you'll see what I'm talking about. So that's Sonnet to Science. Why don't you give it a quick read and let us know down in the comments what you think. And if there's any other Poe poems or short stories that nobody's ever read and you'd like me to do a Curator's Crypt about it, just let us know down in the comments about that too. And if you'd like to help us preserve and present precious Poe first editions like these, why not support the Poe Museum or become a member at poemuseum.org. So thanks for joining us. And until next time, I leave you with more gratuitous footage of the Poe Museum cats doing cat stuff.